I'm a big picture kind of guy. What kind of big picture can you give me to see what the Old Testament is all about? Oh, I'm sorry. My name is David.
Thank you, David, for that question. I think it's an essential question as we continue this startup to our journey through the Old Testament. We want to get the big picture. Because if we don't have the big picture and the big themes, we're going to get lost in the details of verses and chapters and events and words and ideas. I would encourage you as teachers in the church to always start a study of a biblical book with the idea of offering people the big picture. I like to put it this way, that we journey through taking off on a jet airplane. And we take people to about 30,000 feet. And we, if they will allow us, we are their pilots. And as we go along at 30,000 feet, we begin to point certain landmarks out to people. As I quite often fly back from some kind of event I was at and fly back into St. Louis, I love to look down and see the Mississippi converge with the Missouri River. I love to look down and see Busch Stadium, where my favorite baseball team plays, the St. Louis Cardinals. I love to look down and I can spot the arch. I can spot downtown St. Louis. I kind of get the big picture. That's the idea of teaching the Bible. When we're teaching, say, the Gospel of John, we want to give people a big picture. Look at the major themes, so that then when people get down into the nitty-gritty of chapters and verses and words and themes and ideas and theology, they have greater depth and greater insight and can see the big picture. So this is a very fundamental way of teaching the Bible to people, is always begin, I would encourage you, with the big picture. So the big picture that we are beginning with is this idea of how does the Old Testament fit together? And you'll see on the slide in front of you now that there are three major movements in the Old Testament as communicated by these blue lines going down from this figure on the top. The figure on the top will be our figure for God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Why is it round? Well, God is eternal. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever, as we noted in our last question. But also there are these four arrows going out from this circle, indicating to us that our God is always approaching us. We don't approach Him. He approaches us with a word of law and a word of gospel, a word of judgment and a word of grace. Those arrows tell us that God wants us passionately and deeply to be engaged in a life with Him. So God is at the top of your slide, and He is initiating these three major promises or covenants in the Old Testament as we try and fly high on our plane and look down to see where the Missouri converges with the Mississippi and Busch Stadium, etc. So the first major event in the Old Testament is God's covenant with Abraham. You can see that by the letter A on the slide. God makes this covenant with him in Genesis chapter 15, where He comes down in this pot that is boiling and is emitting smoke. That's what you have on your slide. God comes to Abraham, is going to make a threefold promise. I'll make you into a great nation. I will make your name great. That's the first one. The second is that I'm going to give you land. And then the third component of this promise to Abraham is that all the families of the earth will be blessed in you, Abraham. This is as big as it gets in the Old Testament, and we're going to look at this in much greater detail when we actually land the plane. But here at about 30,000 feet, I want you to see this big picture. The big picture is God coming down, reaching out to Abraham and giving him promises. Well, the second major landmark that we want to look out of as we're on this plane is God's dealing with Israel when he brings them out of Egypt and comes and makes a covenant with them at Mount Sinai. You'll see that in the slide, the second major event in the Old Testament. God coming down, and you can see the mountain there, Mount Sinai, the little gold tablets indicating the Ten Commandments. And there is thunder and lightning and smoke and clouds. We'll look at that in great detail as we finally land our plane. I want you to see that God comes to Israel at Sinai, makes a covenant with them, promises to be their God, and they will be his people. And he gives them a missionary task for them to be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, his prized, priceless possession. You can see on the slide that as we look at this typologically, that this is exactly what Jesus is talking about in the upper room, the night in which he was betrayed. He says, "This is my body and blood of the new covenant." That's exactly what is going on in the covenant God makes at Sinai. He comes down to them. There's the shedding of blood. In fact, in Exodus chapter 24, verse 10, it says that Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders eat and drink and see God. It's exactly what is happening in the upper room. The 12 apostles are eating and drinking, and they are seeing God at work for the salvation of humanity. So there's this connecting link between the Sinaitic covenant and the new covenant you can see on the slide between Christ, there he is, he's this servant, that's why he's kneeling, he's got a crown on, he's the Davidic Messiah, but he's offering his true body and true blood. Well, the third major landmark that we would want to notice as we fly high around 30,000 feet is God's promise to David. 2 Samuel 7, a watershed event in the Old Testament, where the D on your slide reminds us of David. God comes down and through Nathan the prophet promises David that there will be a descendant of his upon the throne of Israel forever and ever. Wow, that's like Mount Everest as we look out and on to this landscape called the Old Testament. Then you have the big question mark. What happened to the people who'd received the promises made to Abraham, to Moses on Sinai, to David in 2 Samuel 7? The people worshiped other gods. They turned their backs upon this God who so graciously and lovingly had provided for their deliverance and raised up prophets and kings and fulfilled promises. God exiles his people. Two huge dates. 721 BC, the north is exiled. That is the northern kingdom. In 586 BC, the south is exiled. What's going to happen after the exile? The people come back to the land, that is to say, the people from the south, the people from the north are essentially lost forever. But then you have a bump in the road. On your slide, you see something called Judaism. And this is a fundamental aspect of getting the big picture. Judaism, to make the point as clearly as I can, is different from the belief we find in the Old Testament. What is different from it? you see on your slide the tablets placed over a person. What Judaism begins to do is place a greater emphasis on the work of people in getting in and staying in the covenant. A greater emphasis than the Old Testament makes it. I want you to now understand the definitions of 4 key terms when it comes to getting the big picture of the Old Testament. Jews and Judaism would be the first definition we want to investigate. And simply put, there are no Jews in the Old Testament. Never, ever, ever say that Abraham or Moses was a Jew. They were not Jews. They were believers in Yahweh, and Judaism and Jews have distorted the message of the Old Testament. Sure, there are Judahites in the Old Testament, those who belong to the tribe of Judah, but there are no religious Jews. Jews believe, as you can see on your slide, in elevating our obligation of the Ten Commandments. Judaism, during this intertestamental time between Malachi and Matthew, began to embrace the idea of nationalism, where God essentially only loves the Jews. Judaism began what we would call the 613 oral laws, or tradition of the elders, as Jesus calls it in Mark 7, verse 1. These 613 laws began to distort and misguide the message of the Old Testament. We'll look at this in greater detail as we move on. But the first of the 4 definitions is Judaism. This is a religion that evolved after the Old Testament. The second word I want us to look at in this big picture would be Hebrews. There are Hebrews all over the Old Testament. Joseph tells Potiphar and Pharaoh, I'm a Hebrew. Jonah tells the sailors in Jonah chapter 1, I'm a Hebrew. When Old Testament Israelites identify themselves to non-Israelites, they call themselves Hebrews. Are there Jews in the Old Testament? No. Are there Hebrews? In spades. The third definition would be Israel. Israel means let God rule. That's the name Jacob is given as he wrestles with God all night at the river Jabbok in Genesis chapter 32. Israel would be the covenant name of the people of God in the Old Testament. And their very confession is that we are a people who let God rule, and we don't. I once heard it put this way. There are 2 foundational truths to human enlightenment. Number 1, there is a God. Number 2, you're not Him. That's the confession of Israel. There is a God, and we're not Him. The fourth definition is this: Israeli. Israeli. An Israeli is a member of the 1948 state of Israel, who continues to have problems with the Palestinians. There are no Israelis in the Old Testament. There are only Israelis since 1948. Well, you can begin to see that if we don't properly define Judaism, what a Hebrew is, who Israel is, and who Israelis are, we will have a very difficult time properly teaching and preaching the Old Testament. The promise of the Old Testament is not made to Israelis, okay? It's made to Israelites. There are Hebrews in the Old Testament. There are no Jews. Now, looking again at our slide, Jesus comes and is born in Bethlehem. We can see the manger and this halo-like figure born in that manger. To properly understand this big picture is to understand that Christ came in the midst of Judaism and people who embraced Judaism, and not by and large people who embraced the message of the Old Testament. This, in turn, is a fundamental interpretive key for understanding the New Testament. But that's for a different time and a different place. For now, I want you to see these three major covenants God has made, how Judaism distorted the message of the Old Testament, and how defining Judaism, Hebrews, Israel, and Israelis would be fundamental to having a big picture of this Old Testament. We'll stop here because momentarily we're going to land this plane and we're going to get out and start looking at individual promises and verses of God's promised testaments.